I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. National Security Council Coordinator for Strategic Communications John Kirby answered wide-ranging questions during Tuesday's White House press briefing. While discussing Russia's war on Ukraine, Kirby said that President Biden is in regular contact with Ukrainian President Zelensky. Kirby also claimed directly that Russian President Vladimir Putin is, quote, weaponizing food. Listen in to see what the Biden administration is doing to address this issue.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, right? All right, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you guys enjoyed a long holiday weekend. It's good to see everyone here. Today I'm joined by John Kirby, who is the National Security Council Coordinator for Strategic Communications. I got to get that right. And he's happy to take a few questions. I know there's been some news out there in his world, so Kirby, why don't you take it away?
Thank you, Corinne. Just a couple things at the top, everybody. I think you saw this morning that the administration announced important policy changes with respect to anti-personnel landmines. After conducting a comprehensive policy review, the United States is now joining the vast majority of countries around the world in committing to limit the use of anti-personnel landmines. The use of these weapons put more civilians at risk of being injured by unexploded mines, including children, long after the fighting has stopped, and the President believes strongly that we need to curtail their use worldwide. So this new commitment will align U.S. policy outside of the Korean Peninsula with the key requirements of the Ottawa Convention. That's the international treaty that prohibits the use, the stockpiling, the production, and the transfer of these weapons. The United States is the world's single largest financial supporter of steps to mitigate the harmful consequences of landmines and explosive remnants of war all around the world. Since 1993, the United States has provided over $4.2 billion in aid to over 100 countries for conventional weapons destruction programs. And I'm happy to take questions on that a little bit later. The last thing I just want to open up with is, I think you know the President is preparing for his next trip. This will be to Germany for the G7 and then on to Madrid for the NATO summit. He came into office with the express purpose of revitalizing and reinforcing our allies, our alliances, and our partnerships around the world, and that's exactly what he's done with the G7 and with NATO. His leadership and diplomacy elevated these partnerships as central to meeting the biggest challenges of our time and advanced our shared values to define the decades to come. He has been unafraid to use the convening power of the United States, which is still ample, still relevant, still viable. The free world has demonstrated incredible unity and resolve to advance three key objectives that I think you're going to see are essential to this trip. And we're going to get some time a little bit later on in the week to preview the trip with more detail. But I'll just tell you, these are the three overarching objectives the President has. One, reinforcing our unwavering support of a democratic, sovereign, and prosperous Ukraine and holding Russia accountable for its war of aggression. Two, managing the disruptions in the global economy, including energy and food prices that are caused by this war of aggression that are impacting families all over the world, including here at home. And three, charting an affirmative vision for the world in which democracies can deliver and that we are confident will win over autocratic and corrupt visions. Again, we'll have more to share later in the week, including a background call I think we're going to be doing here in the next day or so, and you guys will all get an invitation to that. So with that, we'll take some questions.
Thanks, John. What can you tell us about this second American who appears to have died in combat in Ukraine?
Don't know a whole lot, but I think you saw the State Department has confirmed that another American citizen has been killed in the fighting in Ukraine, and I'd point you to State for more details on that. Obviously, at the outset, our hearts go out to the family, which are clearly enduring an incredible grief here. Again, we want to stress that this is not the place or the time for Americans to go to Ukraine. It is a war. And if you want to help the people of Ukraine, there's a whole lot of other better options to do that than going and putting yourself in harm's way in the middle of that war.
The President said yesterday that he speaks to Vladimir Zelensky 3 or 4 times a week. Is that accurate, or is that a bit of hyperbole? We only get a readout of their conversations once every couple of weeks.
He speaks to Mr. Zelensky on a routine, regular basis. And I couldn't sit here and give you the exact count. This is the beginning of week 3 for me here. But he speaks to the President Zelensky on a very routine, regular basis. And I would add, it's not just the President. the Department of Defense, the Department of State, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense speak with their counterparts, again, on a routine, regular basis. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, try this again using syllables. The Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff talks to his counterpart regularly, too. And there's an awful lot, and I would go so far as to say almost daily, conversation with the Ukrainians at lower staff levels at both DOD and the Department of State.
April?
Hi, John.
Hey, April.
2 questions. Going back to Ukraine, could you talk about the implications of the grains issue that's heightening in Ukraine as the president of Ukraine talked to the AU about it, the African Union about it, and also the repercussions of what happened in Texas on a national security front when it comes to basically calling President Biden the acting president?
So I'm going to come back to you on the second one because I'm not completely sure I understand the question. But on the first one, let me just do the grain one first. We've talked about this before. President Putin is, no kidding, weaponizing food. Let's just call it what it is. He's weaponizing food. He's got an essential blockade there in the Black Sea so that nothing can leave by sea, and that's, of course, how Ukraine has historically gotten its grain to markets. And so the president's working with leaders around the world to see if there's other overland ways we can do that. And he's exploring a range of options. He's keeping an open mind about how that would look. And there's lots of other of our partners, particularly in Europe, who also want to see that done. So there's a lot of work being done here. But as I said, I think the other day, last week, we know time is not on our side. I mean, this grain is a perishable commodity, so we want to get it out as fast as we can.
Yeah. And on the second question, on the national security front, especially as we're seeing what's happening with the January 6th committee, what does it do on the national security front for Texas to make those strong statements about the 2020 election?
I'm afraid I didn't see the comments. Can you elucidate?
The Texas Republican platform, I think is what she's referring
No, I don't, thank you, no. They're rejecting the president. What's happening is they're saying the president is acting president. The state of Texas.
I'm sorry. Okay, yep, I did. I'm sorry.
I
Look,
can take that one too.
But it's on the national security front.
Okay, cool.
On the national security front, I mean, look, the president is the democratically elected commander-in-chief of this country. And the men and women who serve in uniform understand that. And with the exception of what looks like a small number of Texas legislatures, the American people recognize that. He has the authority, he has the power, he has the responsibility to defend this country. And the things that we're talking about today, whether it's landmine use or grain shipments or assisting Ukraine, is all about our national security, and the president is charged with preserving and maintaining that national security. And it, again, with the exception of a small number of folks there in Texas, the American people recognize that and understand that.
John, what do you make of the Kremlin saying that the Americans captured in Ukraine aren't covered under the Geneva Convention protections for prisoners of war?
Yeah, we've seen the comments by Mr. Peskov with respect to this, not ruling out certain protections. I would tell you a couple of things. One, we still are trying to learn more about these 2 individuals. Okay. Number 2, it's appalling that a public official in Russia would even suggest the death penalty for 2 American citizens that were in Ukraine. We're going to continue to try to learn what we can here about this, and again, stay in touch as much as we can with the families.
If you're not afforded protections under the Geneva Convention, what's the course of action that you're thinking about?
I don't think it'd be useful for us to get into hypotheticals right now, Jackie. I mean, we got more homework here to do, but I do think it's important for us to make it clear, totally appalling, for even the suggestion that result could be the outcome here for these 2 individuals.
Hey, thanks, Karine. John, the Chinese have imported a record amount of oil from Russia, and the trade between the 2 countries is growing. What message do you have to the Chinese related to this?
I think this is just a piece of China's willingness to continue to go along with Russia, and we're seeing this as yet another example a growing collaboration between China and Russia with respect to Ukraine. We have, as we've said at the outset, called on China to be a responsible power here and to join the rest of the world in condemning what Russia has done in Ukraine and in enforcing sanctions against Russia for it. So it's just another example. And look, it's also another example of how global security really is interconnected. It's not just about security on the European continent. It's connected. What's happening in Ukraine, this is a perfect example of how it's connected to national security, our national security interests, and those of allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific as well.
But at what point do they rise to the level where they're breaking sanctions or pushing the line for those sanctions that the U.S. Would like to impose?
Well, again, they haven't been participants in the sanction regime so far.
Go ahead, you did a follow-up.
Thanks, John. Also, India has been buying a lot of the Russian oil that the Europeans aren't buying. So how does the administration keep financial pressure on Russia? And what does this say about U.S.-Indian relations that Prime Minister Modi is making these purchases?
Yeah, India is also a very key strategic partner in the Indo-Pacific region. And there's many ways that partnership represents itself both in defense and security, economic as well. I think we'll let Indian leaders speak to their economic policies. What I can just tell you is we value this bilateral relationship with India, and we continue to want, obviously, every country has to make their decisions for themselves. These are sovereign decisions, but we want as much pressure put internationally on Russia as possible. There needs to be, just last point, there needs to be costs and consequences for what Mr. Putin is doing.
Anything will President Biden be asking G7 leaders to do next week to bring down the cost of energy and bring down the cost of food?
I'm not going to get ahead of the agenda too much today. We'll have more to talk about the trip in the next day or so with more specifics. So I'm not really prepared today to go into too much detail. But as I said in my opening comments, one of the objectives that the president has here for the G7 is to talk to international leaders inside the G7 about supply chain issues, food and fuel supply around the world, and try to minimize the pressures that it has put populations all over the world. But we'll have more a little bit later.
Anything that you think that they can do working in coordination to prevent a global recession?
I think leadership matters a lot here. Multilateral leadership matters a lot because this isn't just affecting the United States, it's affecting the whole world. And I know the president's looking forward to having discussions with world leaders about what together they can do, whether it's increased production or less, more capacity for refining, less dependence. And this is one of the reasons, the president is so committed to clean energy here in this country. That's one way of making us energy independent too. So advancing, it's also good for the climate. So there's an awful lot of cross-cutting objectives here.
All right, just two more.
Follow-up. Do you believe, John, the Peskov comments, obviously in coordination with Vladimir Putin, do you believe they're about more than the discrete facts involving these Americans, but a signal, a larger sort of tactical signal to the American president, to the government, about ways they can use American citizens as a part of this conflict?
I gave up a long time ago trying to get inside Mr. Peskov's head, certainly Mr. Putin's. It's hard to know with great accuracy the answer to your question. But either way, it's equally alarming. Whether they actually mean what they're saying here and that this could be an outcome, that they could levy a death penalty against 2 Americans that were fighting in Ukraine, or that they just feel it's a responsible thing for a major power to do, to talk about doing this as a way of signaling the President of the United States and the American people. Either one of them is equally alarming, and that's why, again, we find it appalling.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. John, why the United States is trying to block the African countries to work with Russia? There is a discussion going on right now at the Senate that the United States is trying to force basically the African countries not to work with Russia. I don't know if you're aware, Russia have relation with many African countries, and Angola is one of them, and many other countries. But right now, it looks like there is a discussion going on at the Senate that the United States is trying to make African countries not to work with Russia. In the beginning, President Biden said that he will work with all nations, Europe, Asia, and even African countries diplomatically. Why don't let the African countries decide who to work with instead of just impose them not to work with for example, Russia?
Yeah, I can't speak for the discussions that are going on in the Senate about this, but you kind of answered the question yourself when you went back to what the president has long said about his foreign policy objectives and goals. Look, he respects and understands that sovereign nations make sovereign decisions. Sovereign nations get to decide who they're going to associate with or who they're not going to associate with. He understands that. He also understands, and I think has been very clear with leaders around the world, that there needs to be consequences for what Mr. Putin is doing in Ukraine. There needs to be costs. He needs to be held accountable for this unprovoked war of aggression. And so it's difficult for him to look at countries around the world who might be willing not to impose those consequences, who might be looking for ways to reward Mr. Putin for what he's doing in Ukraine. So it's a principled.
Forcing countries not to work with Russia.
This isn't about,
Why don't
ma'am.
them decide?
No, ma'am. This is not about forcing. And again, I can't speak to the language you're talking about from the Senate. This isn't about forcing anybody. It's about standing up for a principle, and the principle here is the principle of sovereignty. So it cuts both ways. You know, obviously, sovereign nations need to be able to make their own decisions. The president understands that. That's why, you know, when we were talking about whether Ukraine would or wouldn't join NATO, it's not up to Mr. Putin to get a veto on that. Sovereign nations have to make that decision, and so does the NATO alliance. He understands the sovereign decisions that nations in Africa have to make. But he also believes and stands strongly on the principle that Mr. Putin needs to suffer consequences for this war of aggression, consequences around the world as well. And so he doesn't believe that it's in the interests of what's going on in Ukraine or European security, for that matter, for Mr. Putin to be able to get off scot-free here.
And when the president will travel to Africa, John, he traveled to Europe, Asia, but not Africa. When?
I don't have a trip announcement to make today.
Mr. Kirby, is the president tracking the situation in Ethiopia?
Yes, he is.
And also on the billions of dollars that have flown to Ukraine, how much of that money has gone to gun manufacturers in the U.S.?
How much money has gone to?
$40 billion.
Are you talking about the money?
Ukraine,
the money that we are
approved to Ukraine. How much of that money has gone to gun manufacturers here in the U.S.?
Okay, if you mean defense contractors, we can give you that, and we can have somebody get you the amount of contracts that are going to be or are being let under the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. This is for defense articles, weapons and systems that Ukraine needs. If you're asking me how many are going, you mean like firearm manufacturers here in the United States?
Yes. How much of them, all the money that has gone to Ukraine, how much of that money actually goes to Ukraine?
To the degree that we supply small arms and ammunition, right, to Ukraine, we can get you that figure. I don't have it handy, but that's small arms and ammunition, combat arms that they're using in the field. And, you know, we get caught up a lot talking about HIMARS, right? Long-range rocket systems and artillery systems and tanks and all that. All those big-ticket items that the Ukrainians say they need, and it's true they do. But what they'll also tell you is that the bullets and the small arms are making a big difference every single day, because the fighting in the Donbass is close combat. A lot of long-range fires, lots of artillery, no question. But it's a lot of small arms combat too. So we forget about that. It's an important set of defense articles and systems that we've been sending to Ukraine, and we're going to continue to do it for as long as we can. But as for the exact figures, I have to get that for you.
Biden's response?